Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Rachel Donnelly. Today, we're returning to a case that's haunted Long Island for decades. The killings often called the Gilgo Beach or Long Island serial killer cases. This episode is somber and, frankly, unsettled. Even with a suspect in custody and 7 murder charges filed, so much remains unresolved. We'll talk about who was found, who remains unidentified, where the investigation stumbled, and why this story still leaves families, communities, and investigators with more questions than answers. Let's begin with the place itself, Gilgo Beach, and the landscape that shaped the mystery.
Yeah, Rachel. The geography matters here, you know? Gilgo Beach is a windswept stretch of Barrier Island off Ocean Parkway on Long Island's South Shore. From the road, it's a narrow ribbon, marshes and scrub, and at night, very few lights. That isolation made it, tragically, an ideal place for someone intent on dumping bodies without being seen.
Right. You can almost picture it. An empty roadway, the sound of the ocean and wind, brush between the parkway and the bay. It's the kind of place where neighbors know who belongs and who doesn't. Seasonal beach communities, commuters into Manhattan on one side, and then people living on the margins on the other. And that other side matters deeply to this case.
Exactly. The victims who were found, many of them, were women who worked as escorts and placed ads online, often on Craigslist in the earlier years. That overlap, isolated dumping places and vulnerable victims who may be transient or estranged from family, contributed to long delays in reporting, in searching, and in some cases in identification.
We'll keep coming back to that theme, who we notice in our society and who we don't. But first, a quick chronology that led to the discovery of the dumping ground. It begins, in a way, with one missing woman, Shannon Gilbert, on May 1, 2010. Marcus, can you walk us through who Shannon was and what happened that night?
Shannon Gilbert was 24, from New Jersey, working as an escort. On the night she disappeared, she had gone to Oak Beach, a gated community near Gilgo, for an appointment. She fled a client's home in the early morning hours of May 1, 2010, reportedly in an agitated state. There's a 911 call in which she says, "They're trying to kill me," before the call cuts off. She also knocked on doors, asking for help. Residents called police reporting a distressed woman. Initially, though, police treated her disappearance as a missing person case, not a likely homicide, and search efforts focused inside Oak Beach rather than the nearby marshes.
That's crucial. Shannon's disappearance pushed searches outward. In December 2010, an officer named John Malia, working with a cadaver dog called Blue, expanded a search north along Ocean Parkway. And this is where everything unravels. Blue alerted to remains wrapped in burlap. The first body found that day was later identified as Melissa Barthelemy. Marcus, describe the shock of that first discovery and what followed in December 2010.
Finding one skeleton wrapped in disintegrating burlap was bad enough. Then, within about 500 feet, there were 3 more remains also wrapped in burlap: Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. Those 4, the Gilgo Four, were all adult women who worked as escorts and had advertised online. That cluster sent a clear message that something systematic had happened in that corridor along Ocean Parkway.
Yeah, the phrase Gilgo Four begins to circulate. Media labels follow: Gilgo Beach Killer, Craigslist Ripper, Long Island Serial Killer. Names that, honestly, obscure the people behind them. Each of those 4 were in their 20s, often struggling with addiction or economic pressures, mothers in some cases. And they were all tragically vulnerable.
And the pattern grew. In March and April of 2011, police expanded searches east and west along Ocean Parkway and into neighboring counties, and more remains were found. The number of discovered remains moved the case out of a cluster into what looked like a dumping ground. Torsos and body parts dating back to earlier years. That's when investigators started to realize this might span more than just an isolated string of murders.
Let's pause for a second and name some of those additional victims because they matter to the narrative and to the unanswered questions. There were remains that dated back to the late 1990s and early 2000s, torsos found in Manorville in 2000 and 2003 that were later linked to skulls and other parts found near Gilgo. One of those is Valerie Mack, identified in 2020 after years as Jane Doe number 6, and another is Jessica Taylor, whose torso was found in Manorville in 2003 and later matched to remains near Gilgo in 2011. Marcus, the presence of those earlier victims, dismembered torsos in woods and then heads found near the beach, what does that suggest about the offender or offenders?
It suggests several possibilities. One is a single offender whose methods and disposal sites evolved over time, from wooded areas and remote lots to the Ocean Parkway corridor. Dismemberment in Manorville and intact bodies wrapped in burlap at Gilgo could fit an evolving pattern. Another possibility is multiple offenders using overlapping areas. The variation in victim type and disposal methods, even the presence of a toddler and a male or possible trans victim among the remains, complicates the single killer theory. What we do know is the timeline grows longer than the initial 2010-2011 discoveries and must be considered across decades.
An important aside there. The toddler and her mother, long called Baby Doe and Peaches, later identified as Tatiana Marie Dykes and Tanya Denise Jackson, were only publicly identified in 2025. But then, and this is a major twist, their father, Andrew Dykes, was arrested and charged with their murders in December 2025. And police say those deaths are not part of the Long Island serial killings. That's a clear example of how geographic proximity can lead to misattribution. Marcus, how should that affect our thinking about other bodies found along Ocean Parkway?
It's a cautionary tale. Dump sites can attract multiple offenders over time, and proximity alone doesn't prove a common perpetrator. For investigators and the public, the default assumption that all the remains at Gilgo were killed by one person was always convenient but not necessarily accurate. The Tanya and Tatiana identification and arrest show how forensic genealogy can correct earlier assumptions, and how messy the truth can be when bodies from different years and different contexts end up in the same corridor.
Let's be clear about the civic failures, because this case is also about institutions. Early cases from the 1990s and 2000s were handled by different agencies and often not connected. Stigma about sex work and assumptions about transients made some victims low priority. And then there were allegations of outright obstruction. James Burke, the Suffolk County police chief, later convicted on unrelated corruption charges, reportedly blocked FBI involvement for years. Marcus, walk us through why that blockage mattered.
As the record shows, Burke's resistance to FBI involvement delayed federal forensic and behavioral resources that could have been applied earlier. The FBI brings nationwide databases, specialized labs, and analytical teams. And the Golden State Killer investigation, which relied on genealogical techniques later on, was instructive. Suffolk only officially welcomed the FBI in December 2015, at which point the case had already been simmering for half a decade. That delay eroded public trust and likely cost investigators valuable time in cross-referencing early evidence and DNA.
And public trust matters deeply here. Families of the victims repeatedly told reporters they felt ignored, that leads were cold, and that the county handling of the case was inconsistent. Now, move forward to the forensic breakthroughs, genetic genealogy. The identification of Valerie Mack in 2020 by genealogical methods changed the conversation. Marcus, can you explain, in plain terms, what genetic genealogy did for the case?
Sure. Genetic genealogy means taking degraded or partial DNA from remains and uploading it to databases where people have submitted consumer DNA tests for ancestry research. Investigators look for relatives, distant cousins, then build family trees to narrow down possible identities. That's how Valerie Mack was identified in 2020, after years as Jane Doe number 6. The same technique later helped identify Tanya Jackson and her daughter in 2025. It's powerful, but it's also legally and ethically novel, especially when labs like Astrea Forensics, which specialized in low-quality DNA, are involved.
Right, and that legal controversy is now a central piece of the trial preamble. The defense in the Rex Heuermann case sought to exclude DNA evidence from Astrea, arguing the lab lacked a New York health permit and that the methods were novel. The judge ultimately refused to exclude it, saying the permit issue didn't invalidate the lab's role. This became one of the first major New York cases where advanced genealogical DNA analysis was admitted. Marcus, does that set a precedent?
It certainly pushes the envelope in New York. Admitting such evidence gives prosecutors a powerful tool and suggests courts will accept genealogical evidence when it meets reliability thresholds. But it also raises enduring questions about privacy and about ensuring properly regulated laboratories handle criminal evidence. This case may be cited in future challenges about the admissibility of genealogical or highly degraded DNA forensics in state courts.
Let's back up and talk about the suspect who's been charged, Rex Andrew Heuermann. He was arrested July 13, 2023, in Manhattan near his office, and initially charged with 3 of the Gilgo Four, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. Later, charges expanded through 2024 to include Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, and ultimately Sandra Castilla from 1993. Marcus, can you summarize who Heuermann is based on what's in the public record?
Heuermann is a longtime Massapequa Park resident, born in 1963, who worked as an architect in Midtown Manhattan. On the surface, he was a middle-aged professional, married with children, someone with a routine commute that would place him roughly between his home and work along routes that touch Long Island's South Shore. The arrest came after investigators combined phone data, burner phone records, online activity tied to escort ads, vehicle information, and degraded DNA evidence that, when analyzed by Astrea, suggested a match or close relationship to Heuermann. That combination, not just DNA alone, is what prosecutors are using to build a timeline.
There's a lot to unpack there. One piece, Melissa Barthelemy's sister received disturbing phone calls from Melissa's phone after her disappearance, calls that taunted the family and seemed to come from crowded Manhattan locations. There's also the use of burner phones by whoever was contacting these women and cell site records that placed some activity in Massapequa Park and Midtown Manhattan. Marcus, how do those digital footprints help build a case?
Digital footprints can be incredibly persuasive. Burner phones were used to arrange appointments and check voicemail accounts tied to escort ads. Even prepaid phones leave traces. Cell site records, call times, and tower pings can place a device in a general area at a given time. Combined with IP address records from email or ad accounts and matching vehicle registrations for witnesses' descriptions, investigators can triangulate and build circumstantial narratives that link a suspect's routine and locations to victim contact and possible disposal routes.
But circumstantial evidence can be messy. The defense argued for separate trials, saying the differences across decades and methods would prejudice jurors if the cases were tried together. A judge, though, ruled that all 7 murder charges would be tried together, citing sufficient similarities and judicial efficiency. That was a win for prosecutors and a major blow to Heuermann's defense. Marcus, how does a single trial shape the story the jury will hear?
A single trial lets prosecutors present a narrative of a long-running, consistent offender. They can show patterns across multiple victims, online contact, geographic overlap, similar packaging like burlap, degraded DNA links, to argue for a single responsible party. For the defense, it means they must contest multiple streams of evidence at once. The risk for the defense is juror prejudice from seeing the full scope of alleged crimes together. The risk for the prosecution is that defense success on one count could ripple. If convicted, though, misjoinder arguments often move to appeal.
Let's dwell on lingering uncertainties, the core of our episode, still unanswered. First, is there really one killer or multiple? There are arguments both ways. On the one hand, overlapping victim profiles and geographic patterns support a single offender for the cases prosecutors have tied to Heuermann. On the other hand, there are differences: a toddler and her mother, a male or possibly trans victim labeled Asian doe, dismemberment in earlier Manorville cases, and the confirmed separate culprit for Tanya and Tatiana. Marcus, what's your read?
My read is cautious. Prosecutors have made a careful decision to charge Heuermann with 7 murders where they say evidence converges. But the broader landscape, 11 or more sets of remains discovered over decades, suggests multiple actors may have been at work in this corridor. The existence of other convicted offenders in the region, like John Bittrolf, adds to the complexity. So, legally and practically, the case before the court is the one framed by prosecutors. For historical truth, however, it's possible other killings remain unconnected and unsolved.
That caveat is hard to accept for victims' families who want wholeness, a full accounting of what happened to their loved ones. For many families, the arrest brought mixed emotions: relief that someone is charged, but anger and sorrow about the years of delay and the fact that not all victims are accounted for. Marcus, how do families cope when identifications come decades later, sometimes only after genealogical sleuthing?
It's devastating and disruptive. Some families waited decades without knowing what happened. Others were notified years later that remains matched a loved one. Identification by genealogy can bring closure, but also reopen trauma. In the Tanya and Tatiana case, identification led not to a connection with the Gilgo suspects, but to the arrest of a family member, which adds layers of betrayal. Families often report a complicated mix of relief, rage, and continued grief.
And the neighborhoods, Long Island communities, they've lived with this fear for years. People in Oak Beach, Gilgo, Manorville carried a low-level dread: remote roads, the idea of an unseen predator, and the periodic national attention that flares and fades. That forgetting and remembering cycle matters because it influences pressure on police and political will. Marcus, what institutional lesson should be drawn from the Suffolk handling of this case?
There are several institutional lessons. First, early jurisdictional coordination matters. Bodies found in different counties years apart need cross-referencing early. Second, stigma kills urgency. Outreach to sex worker communities and better protocols for missing person reports are essential. Third, law enforcement transparency and resisting politicized cover-ups, as alleged with the blockage of the FBI, are core to maintaining public trust. Finally, as forensic tools evolve, agencies need standards for labs and evidence so that innovations like genealogical DNA stand on firmer legal ground.
We need to talk about technology's twin roles. Craigslist and burner phones made victims vulnerable, and the same technologies and DNA databases ultimately helped identify victims and possibly suspects. That duality is an important theme. Marcus, ethically, how do we balance using consumer DNA databases for justice with concerns about privacy and consent?
It's a thorny balance. On one hand, genetic genealogy has solved cold cases and given families answers. On the other, many users of consumer DNA services didn't explicitly consent to law enforcement searches when they uploaded their profiles. Policies have emerged allowing law enforcement access under certain conditions, but the law is still catching up. We need transparency, limitations, oversight, and clear rules about when family tree searches are permissible. Otherwise, we risk eroding public confidence in these tools and exposing people to privacy intrusions.
Let's touch on Shanann Gilbert again, because she's both central and controversial. Suffolk County ultimately labeled her death as likely accidental, suggesting she drowned or succumbed in the marsh after running away. Her family disagrees, and many observers think she was murdered and potentially tied to the killer. What does Shanann symbolize in this larger story, Marcus?
Shanann symbolizes how a missing person can be both the catalyst for discovery and also marginalized by investigators. Her 911 call and frantic behavior suggested she feared for her life, and the searches that followed led to the Gilgo discoveries. But the official ruling of accidental death created a rift. Families and advocates saw it as a dismissal. Shanann's case remains one of the largest unresolved questions. Was she a victim of the same offender, or an unfortunate catalyst for revealing an unrelated dumping ground? The truth still feels unresolved.
That unresolved feeling is exactly why the episode's title keeps repeating in our minds, Still Unanswered. Before we move to closing reflections, I want to ask about the legal front. As of early 2026, Heuermann remains in custody, pleaded not guilty, and faces a single consolidated trial on 7 counts. There's no completed trial yet. Marcus, what should listeners expect next in terms of legal strategy and evidentiary disputes?
Expect long, technical battles over admissibility of DNA and genealogical evidence, challenges to chain of custody and lab procedures, disputes about whether disparate cases should have been joined, and heavy reliance on circumstantial evidence like phone records and IP traces. The defense will likely attack the novelty and reliability of Estrella's analyses and argue prejudice from the multi-count indictment. The prosecution will emphasize pattern, technology, and cumulative evidence. This will be a precedent-heavy fight that could shape future uses of genealogical DNA in New York courts.
Short pause. Marcus, quick reaction?
It's going to be slow and painful for families. Yeah.
Let's return, briefly, to the human impact. Families of the Gilgo Four, Maureen, Melissa, Megan, Amber, they gave interviews, held press conferences, demanded answers across years. The identification of Valerie Mack and others decades after their disappearances shows how the state of identification can change lives, for better or worse. Marcus, what do you hear most from victims' families in cases like this?
They mostly want recognition and dignity. They want investigators to treat victims as people, not case files. They want to know how their loved ones died and why the system took so long. They want assurance that lessons have been learned so future victims don't fall through the cracks. Those are practical demands, but they're also moral.
I want to drop in a short human note here. Melissa's sister received those taunting calls after Melissa disappeared. That detail, the cruelty of someone calling and mocking a family, stayed with me. It illustrates how callous some unknown caller was, and how digital traces, even in those cruel acts, can later become forensic breadcrumbs. Marcus, any final technical notes we should flag for listeners about how modern investigators stitch this case together?
The investigators used a mosaic of techniques: cell site records tying burner phones to areas, IP and email traces linking ad accounts to locations, vehicle registration cross-referencing witness descriptions, and genetic genealogy on degraded DNA samples. Each alone might be circumstantial, but together they create a web that can be compelling to a jury. The complexity is why trials like this take years, and why defense teams attack both technical and procedural points relentlessly.
Okay, we're nearing the end of the episode, but I want to leave listeners with some broader reflections. 1. Technology can both enable terrible crimes and, years later, help solve them. 2. Institutional failures, whether from bias, turf wars, or outright obstruction, can leave scars that last for decades. 3. Identification and convictions, while necessary, may not answer every question, and families may still live with ambiguity. Marcus, your closing thoughts?
This case is a reminder that justice is not only about locking someone up. It's about building systems that listen to marginalized communities, that coordinate across jurisdictions, and that adopt forensic innovations responsibly. Even with a suspect charged for 7 murders, the fuller truth of the Ocean Parkway corridor may never be wholly known. That uncertainty is painful, but it's also instructive. It tells us where we need to improve.
We'll close with a return to the people behind the headlines. Names again: Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, Valerie Mack, Jessica Taylor, Sandra Castilla. 7 lives prosecutors say are tied to Heuermann. Then there are others: Tanya Jackson and her daughter Tatiana, later linked to a different suspect, and unidentified victims like the Asian doe. Each name is a person with family and history, and each deserves to be remembered not just as a statistic, but as a life ended far too soon. Marcus, one last short note.
Remember to center the victims, always.
Thank you. If this episode raised questions for you, or if you have information relevant to these cases, please contact law enforcement or the DA's office. We'll include resources in the episode notes. This is Still Unanswered. I'm Rachel Donnelly. Thank you, Marcus Ellison, for the context.
Thanks, Rachel. And thank you to listeners for staying with such difficult material. Remember, caring about victims matters more than sensationalizing crime.
One final thing before we sign off. Cases like Gilgo force us to ask how society treats people on the margins: sex workers, people struggling with addiction, estranged families. If there's a policy lesson here, it's that dignity in life would likely save lives in the long run. We'll keep following this case as it moves toward trial, and we'll return with updates. For now, still unanswered. For now, take care. Take care.